A big renovation project for taking care of older folks. It costs $30,000. But wait, what's happening? That's the house of my wife's parents, isn't it? A man on the phone claims to be married to my wife's estranged sister. The talk is all confusing, so it seems like my sister-in-law might be planning something. My name's Martha, and I'm 56 years old. I stay at home. My kids, a son and a daughter, are grown-ups now and don't live with us anymore. It's just me, my husband, and his parents living together. We all get along well, which is nice because I lost my own parents when I was young. My husband and I were supposed to live with his parents when we got married, but my mother-in-law, who had a tough time with her own mother-in-law, had the house changed so we could have our own space. Even though we share the house, we each have our own private area. That's probably why we get along so well. My husband still works during the day, so I spend a lot of time with my in-laws. One day, while my father-in-law was busy on the farm, I was getting lunch ready in the kitchen. I planned for us to eat outside together. Then we got a call from one of my father-in-law's friends on the farm, saying he fell and hurt himself. They rushed him to the family doctor in a truck. My mother-in-law and I left the food and hurried to the hospital. When we got to the hospital, they were rushing my father-in-law into emergency surgery. Despite seeming healthy, he was in his 80s, and recovering from a fracture would be tough at his age. The doctors warned us that he might need a wheelchair afterwards. But I was determined. As long as he's alive, that's what matters. I'll be there to support him, I said. We waited nervously while he was in surgery, hoping for the best. By the time my husband finished work and joined us, the surgery was over. We were relieved to see my father-in-law sleeping peacefully in his hospital room, without any major complications. We decided to stick together and support him through his recovery. But sadly, our hopes were dashed when my father-in-law passed away suddenly a month later. His age had made him vulnerable, and he caught an infection after the surgery. Since many of his friends and relatives were also elderly, we didn't want to upset them by spreading the news of his passing. So, after discussing it, we opted for a small family funeral. But even that didn't solve all our problems. What about my sister-in-law? I asked my mother-in-law and husband. They didn't look happy, probably remembering her troubled marriage. My in-laws weren't happy about my sister-in-law's marriage. They strongly opposed it. While my husband wasn't as against it, he wasn't thrilled either. This created tension between them, and their relationship became distant. But she was still their daughter, so shouldn't she be allowed to attend the funeral? They agreed that if we could find her, she could come. But we couldn't reach her, so the funeral went ahead without her. It's just how things are with her. It's fate. Don't worry about it, Martha. My mother-in-law told me as we returned home from the crematorium with my father-in-law's ashes. My father-in-law's sudden death caught us all off guard. We weren't prepared for it mentally. We rushed through the funeral and cremation. We held his ashes, lit incense, and spent the next few days feeling lost. It's easier when my husband is here. We can talk and support each other. But when he's at work, I can't bear being alone in the quiet house, so I go to my mother-in-law's room. I know my mother-in-law is going through even more pain and sadness than I am. After all, she lost her husband suddenly, someone she had been with for so many years. So even though it's hard, I try to act cheerful around her. But my mother-in-law was more accepting of the situation. I thought I'd be in this state for the next 49 days, but yes, we can go through his things later. But you know, I'm already over 80, my mother-in-law said. You look so young for your age, mother-in-law, I replied. Not being sick often, she'd mentioned that the only time she was ever in the hospital was when she gave birth. Basically, she was telling us that she's healthy and we don't need to worry about her. You're so kind, Martha, but while I can still move around, I want to go through our things, including his, she said. I get it. It's important to keep those memories safe, like my father-in-law's belongings, I replied. Got it. Just tell me if you need any help, I offered. She asked me right away to help her reach things that were too high for her. As we looked at old photos of my father-in-law, My mother-in-law happily talked about their younger days, sharing stories about their trips and adventures. I listened closely, nodding along. The phone rang, breaking the quiet of the room. Since my mother-in-law doesn't use a smartphone, the landline is her main way of communicating. I wonder who's calling. Only a few people usually call, and they're all close friends who know what's been going on, I thought. It could be important. I'll get it, I said, realizing it would be easier for me to answer than for my mother-in-law, who had been mentioning how hard it was getting for her to move around. I quickly answered the phone by the entrance, and a man I didn't recognize greeted me politely. He said he was my sister-in-law's husband, but I'd never met him before, so I wasn't sure if he was really who he claimed to be. As I listened, I started to wonder if this was some kind of scam targeting older people. Then he said, "I want to talk to you about the home renovation for caregiving, but my father-in-law had already passed away. Why was he bringing up caregiving renovations now? Did he get the wrong house?" "No, my mother-in-law didn't need that level of care." "Excuse me, but are you sure you have the right house?" I asked cautiously. The man claiming to be my sister-in-law's husband mentioned her maiden name, which matched my husband's family. So there was no mistake that this was their family home. Plus, the name matched my sister-in-law's. "It's true that the woman you mentioned is my husband's sister. Thank you for believing me. With all the trouble our marriage has caused, I was worried I had made a bad impression again," the man said. I wasn't sure why my in-laws were so against my sister-in-law's marriage, but I didn't get a bad impression from this man at all. In fact, he seemed very humble and sincere. My brother-in-law explained that he heard the caregiving renovation would cost around $30,000. He felt bad for any trouble he may have caused and wanted to make up for it. He planned to pay the $30,000, but couldn't get the money ready by the deadline. He called to ask if we could possibly wait and extend the payment deadline. It's awkward to let him explain everything before saying this, but since he spoke with such passion, I failed to convey the truth. I thought to myself, "Thanks for being polite. Now, about the extension, just hold on a sec," I said, then turned to my mother-in-law. "When did you find out about the changes to caregiving?" I asked her. "My father-in-law was really healthy and was working on the farm until recently," she said. "So you didn't need any caregiving help at all?" I double-checked. "No, not at all. Wait. Are you talking about the past?" she realized. "Yes, my father-in-law died. We buried him and cremated him recently," I told him. "I understand. Well." I could imagine him getting flustered on the phone. He must be confused because of what his wife told him and what actually happened. I had planned to stay like this until the 49th day, but yes, we can go through his things later. But you know, mother-in-law, I'm already over 80. You seem much younger than 80, mother-in-law. She rarely got sick. She'd mentioned that the only time she went to the hospital was to give birth. Basically, she was saying she's healthy and we don't need to worry about her. "You're thoughtful, Martha, but as long as I can still move around, I want to organize my stuff, and his too." "I get it. I don't want anyone else going through my father-in-law's things and memories either." "Got it. Just tell me if you need a hand," I said. She quickly asked me to assist her in reaching things that were too high for her. While we were sorting through old photos of my father-in-law, my mother-in-law joyfully recalled memories of their younger years, recounting tales of their travels and adventures. I listened closely, nodding in agreement when the landline rang. Since my mother-in-law doesn't have a smartphone, the landline is her primary way of communicating. "I wonder who that could be," I remarked. There were only a few people who usually called, and they were all close friends who knew our situation. I thought they might avoid calling if they knew, but it could be an emergency. I decided to answer it. It was better for me to move rather than make my mother-in-law, who had been mentioning how hard it was to sit and stand, get up. So I quickly picked up the phone near the entrance. A man's voice I didn't recognize greeted me. He introduced himself as my sister-in-law's husband, speaking very politely. However, I had never met him before. I wasn't sure if he really was who he claimed to be. As I listened, Wondering if this was some new scam targeting elderly people, he said, "I want to talk to you about the home renovation for caregiving. My father-in-law had already passed away. Why was he bringing up caregiving renovations now? Did he mistake my mother-in-law for someone else? No, she didn't need that level of care. Excuse me, but are you sure you have the right house?" I asked. This is my wife's family home, right?" The man claiming to be my sister-in-law's husband mentioned her maiden name. It did match my husband's family, and there was no doubt this was their home. Plus, the name matched my sister-in-law's. It's true that the woman you mentioned is my husband's sister. Thank goodness. Thank you for believing me. With all the trouble our marriage has caused, I was worried I had made a bad impression again. I don't understand why my in-laws were so against my sister-in-law's marriage, but I don't feel any negativity towards this man. In fact, he seems really humble and sincere. According to my brother-in-law, he heard that the cost of caregiving renovations would be around $30,000. He wants to do his best to make up for any inconvenience he may have caused. He shared all this with me, seeming genuinely honest. I asked him how the story about my father-in-law needing care came up. He brought it up a few years back. At first, he seemed to be sending a fixed amount every month to help with caregiving expenses. But it was clear that neither my father-in-law nor mother-in-law had heard anything about it. If they had known, my mother-in-law would have invited him to the funeral, he explained. Her mother was thankful and said it helped, so I thought maybe I was slowly being forgiven. But if she was forgiving you, wouldn't she have talked to you about it? I questioned. That's right. What's more, the amount of money he sent each year kept going up. He was sending more money every month, thinking we had requested extra help. But we didn't remember asking for anything like that. So none of that money actually reached you? I asked. When I confirmed, I could imagine him getting really upset. It was difficult for me to share this information as well. As I listened, I started to wonder if my sister-in-law. I can't say for sure if you're being scammed, but I hesitated. You don't have to sugarcoat it. I am being scammed, right? He interrupted. I couldn't outright confirm or deny it, so I stayed silent. He probably took my silence as confirmation. What should I do? He asked. Even though it wasn't really my place to answer, assuming he was indeed being scammed, I couldn't just leave my sister-in-law, my husband's sister, alone, despite our strained relationship. I told him we'd talk about it and get back to him later, and that was the end of the call. When I went back to my mother-in-law, she remarked, "That was a long call. Was it a persistent salesperson? You should just hang up on those." No, it was a man claiming to be my sister-in-law's husband, I replied. I then told my mother-in-law about the conversation. She was shaking with anger as she listened, and her fury only intensified afterward. What kind of person is she, using her father as an excuse to ask her husband for money? She exclaimed. It seemed that my sister-in-law had a history of being irresponsible with money, buying expensive things she couldn't afford with her allowance or earnings from part-time jobs. Her behavior seemed very suspicious. When she wanted to marry, her partner was a man with a significantly high income and a lot of pre-existing wealth, which made her parents strongly against the marriage. Their opposition wasn't for my sister-in-law's sake, but because of her partner. Afterward, we decided to wait at the house of the person responsible, along with her husband, for her to come back home. I couldn't recall the last time I saw my sister-in-law. When she decided to date her then-boyfriend with marriage in mind, she introduced him to her parents and brother. There was some uproar about her marriage, but since I wasn't yet part of the family, I didn't attend. So this would be my first meeting with my sister-in-law's husband. From what I gathered over the phone, he seemed sincere and pleasant. I had heard he earned well, but he didn't seem to live extravagantly. It seemed he was trying to live modestly. However, if one of the reasons for this was my sister-in-law's deception, it must be a mix of complicated emotions, meeting my sister-in-law again after many years. My sister-in-law, who never expected her mother to be at her home, was so surprised that her eyes widened as she stood frozen. The impression I had of my sister-in-law was of someone who liked flashy things, but the sister-in-law in front of me was excessively flashy and lacked any sense of style, which was hard to watch. The three of us had agreed beforehand to go along with my sister-in-law's story. Initially, we decided not to bring up the fact that she was lying. "It's been a while. I'm glad to see you're doing well," I said kindly. When my sister-in-law was suddenly spoken to with kindness, she stammered in response to her mother. She probably thought her lies had been found out and that she was going to be scolded, but she seemed confused by the unexpected kindness. "I wanted to see your face after all this time. Have you been doing well?" her mother continued. We didn't tell her the truth about her father's passing and kept up the pretense that he was still alive. I also apologized for not staying in touch and gave a suitable greeting. My sister-in-law humbly said she was glad her mother seemed well and that she had been worried about her. However, she didn't mention her father. It would be awful if the conversation turned to him, and the topic of caregiving expenses slipped out of my husband's mouth. It seemed my husband and she had met before, but it seemed her lies hadn't been exposed. She probably thought she could get away with it and not get caught. "Your mom looks happy. It seems you two are getting along well as a couple," my mother-in-law said happily. She hoped my sister-in-law would have a change of heart and start repaying her husband bit by bit. The idea was to shower her with praise in hopes of encouraging her to change her behavior. Somehow, my sister-in-law got carried away and told my mother-in-law that she would support her if she ever needed caregiving, even saying not to worry about money. It's surprising she could say such things in front of her husband, who had been supporting her out of goodwill, I thought. We expressed our gratitude and left that day. My sister-in-law was acting strange, asking for a lot of money. We suspected she was using it for herself. We didn't know where all the $30,000 went, so we hired a private investigator to check her money situation. The money meant for taking care of someone each month was actually being used by her for herself. But it turned out she was also spending a lot of money on a guy she really liked at a club, trying to make him the best. She was spending too much, buying expensive things and getting into debt she couldn't pay back. The guy she liked owed a lot of money to, around $30,000. When my sister-in-law's husband found out, he got really mad. He decided he couldn't ignore it anymore. He made plans while she was away with the guy she liked, not knowing anything about what was going on. My sister-in-law came back home after a few days and found that her house was totally empty. There wasn't any furniture or anything belonging to her left. She started to panic and tried to call her husband, but he didn't pick up. So she called me instead. At first, she was really upset, but when I mentioned her trip with the guy she liked, she suddenly became quiet. She didn't ask how I knew about it because then she would have to admit what she did. Now it was my turn to tell her everything without giving her a chance to argue back. "I can't believe you thought you could get away with this and took advantage of everyone. You betrayed your mother, your husband, and now it's hard to see anyone wanting to help you," I told her firmly. I also mentioned that the excuse she used about her father-in-law wasn't valid anymore because he had passed away. I understood she didn't know about his death, but it was still wrong to use her father's situation to ask for money. I let her know that her ex-husband also found out the truth, and feeling abandoned, she screamed like a mad person over the phone. Her ex-husband didn't want to talk to her, and to avoid troubling my elderly mother-in-law any further, I offered to be the middle person between them and my sister-in-law. She kept causing a scene over the phone. It was kind of sad to see her like this, not even realizing her father had passed away and still using him as an excuse. She might feel sorry for it later, but it's too late now. I gave her one final message. "Your ex-husband plans to ask for all the money back that you gave to the guy at the club. You'll have to find a way to pay off the $30,000 debt on your own." Later, she got legal documents from a lawyer. She wanted to talk to her husband about it, but he refused. He was really angry and didn't want anything to do with his ex-wife, even for legal stuff. Without any agreement, my sister-in-law had to live on a tight budget and work hard. She couldn't afford to spend money at the club anymore, and the guy she liked stopped paying attention to her, leaving her with just the big debt she owed. Sometimes, scary debt collectors would come around. My sister-in-law was naturally scared, always worrying about the lawyer's letters and the debt collectors showing up. As for the rest of us, we went back to our normal lives. It took a while to go through my father-in-law's things, but we decided to move on as a family, including his part. Recently, my mother-in-law has been getting weaker, and I think she might need care soon. Since we couldn't help my father-in-law, my husband and I agreed to do our best for my mother-in-law.